Welcome to the Tennis IQ podcast. I'm Josh Berger.
And I'm Brian Lomax. And when I was 11 years old, I was playing in a club championship 12 and under tournament. And I was in the semifinal. And in this semifinal, I was playing another kid who's quite popular at the club. Most people expected him to win. Most people wanted him to win. I don't know that I had any expectations of winning or losing in this particular match. But in the end, I did win. And I won fairly routinely. And then sometime later, it came back to me that the other player was giving a reason for why he lost. And his reason for losing to me, and I was younger, he was 12, I was 11, was that during the match, he had an eyelash stuck in his eye. And at 11, I kind of knew that that was a bit of a ridiculous reason or excuse for putting out there like why you lost. But the reason I'm telling this story is that we often tell ourselves stories about success and failure. And there's a theory in sports psychology called attribution theory, which is something that we would really like to dive into a bit more today. It's not necessarily something we would explicitly discuss with a player, but when Josh and I are working with players, this is going through our minds as we listen to players tell the story of how they were successful or not on a particular day.
So I think that the story that you're bringing up highlights how athletes attribute it can be blame, right? That they can blame their performance on a wide variety of factors. And we see this a lot. We see, people point to all sorts of different factors as reasons why they won, why they lost, why they played well, why they didn't play well. That could be an eyelash in the eye. That could be the weather, right? It was so windy, or it was hot, or it was cold, or it was because we're playing indoors or because we're playing outdoors. It could be factors about the opponent, right? The result was the way it was because my opponent was moonballing, or because they were pushing, or because they're a lefty, or because they were making bad line calls. It could be attributing the result to something about you, right? Oh, I lost because I didn't get enough sleep, or I lost because I was tired from the match before, or I lost because I was hungry. So, I think when we start to think about this concept, in this theory, I think it's important to recognize that, we all attribute things in our lives and our performances to different factors, but we have a theory here, which I can briefly explain a little bit about, which is referred to as attribution theory. And essentially, there's three dimensions. There's locus of control, which can be either internal or external. There's stability, which can either be stable or unstable, and then controllability, controllable or uncontrollable. And we can look at these three factors and determine with certain examples whether things are, whether things that we're attributing are internal or external, whether they're ultimately stable or unstable, meaning that, are they essentially permanent or impermanent, and whether they're in our control or not. So as sort of a starting point, we can look at different situations and look at it through those three factors of locus, stability, and controllability, and maybe look at some different examples and then talk about what specifically players can do to better attribute their performances. Because I think how we not just how we perform, but how we view our performances and how we attribute our performances to these different factors can make quite a big difference in terms of how we, how we move on from our results and hopefully learn something from them.
So let's start, Josh, maybe with some examples around how we explain success,
Yep.
not just failure. Um, and maybe we go to something like, I won this match because my first serve was so great and reliable today. So that is potentially a really good way to explain something that happened. It's, your first serve is not fully controllable how often you get in, but you have a lot of influence over that. And then you're also expressing confidence and sort of celebrating the success of that. So I think that's a positive way of explaining why you won today or why you were successful. It was about a skill, it was about an ability. Versus, and I'll admit that I have done this where I've had maybe a less helpful way of explaining success. So there have been a couple of wins that I've had against really great players, but I knew that they were kind of hurt. Something was going on. And so a part of my explanation for why I won wasn't that, hey, that I played so great, which I did actually, if I really look at those matches hard. But rather that, well, they weren't at their best. He's been hurt for a while. He's got a really tough wrist injury. He's just coming back. So it was in a way like, yeah, I won, but it wasn't so much me. It was more, I was a little bit lucky that he wasn't at full, his full potential, his full conditioning, and so the hard part about that is that, I'm not building any confidence with that sort of explanation. I'm not really even looking at the match in an objective way because the opponent chose to play that day. And if you choose to play, then you're putting it out on the line. So who's to say that even though he had a wrist injury, that he wasn't playing really well that day? I'm making an excuse for him for him losing that match. So sometimes, yeah, we attribute our own success to luck or some other factor that, like if I had accepted the fact that, oh yeah, that kid, yeah, he had an eyelash in his eye. That's I feel bad for him. That's too bad. I guess that's the only reason I won. I don't get a lot out of that. And the thing is now I've kind of taken it away from things I can control, my own ability. But as you were saying, like, this is important for how we move forward. If I'm constantly attributing my success to things that are not part of my abilities or control, it's going to be hard for me to build confidence in my game. And I'm going to go into matches thinking I need to get lucky,
right,
in order to be successful here today. So, yeah, even how we explain success to ourselves, it's important to pay attention to the language that we're using, around these ideas of, internal, external control. Whether this is sort of a stable or unstable type of thing, or is it something I can control?
Definitely. And I think it's easy to fall into that trap, right? If you had bought into the fact that the result was the way it was just because of this eyelash, then that doesn't serve you ultimately, right? That doesn't serve you. You feel like, okay, I just won that because I was lucky, right? It's not because I handled situations out there well. It's not because I've been training hard and improving on my game and I've gotten to a certain point where I can compete with and beat strong players. It's not because I managed my emotions well and took things one point at a time and handled, the match the way that I wanted to. It's because of this eyelash, which is obviously something completely out of your control. So I think, yeah, instead of us viewing our success as a result of luck or something that we can't do anything about. I think there is a lot of power in believing and legitimately believing, you're right, believing based on evidence that it is something, it's based on something that we do, that we can control, and that is, something related to what we worked for, both long term and in the moment.
Yeah. So I think it's key for us to try to bring things down to um, what we can control, sort of like the internal piece and what's controllable, and really looking at hard work. If we look at maybe some explanations of failure, I think we can have, adaptive ones and maladaptive
Yep.
explanations of failure. I think an adaptive one, or or a more functional one, is looking rationally at the performance and really understanding a root cause for that. Makes me think of the story of Eric Budorak, in his TED Talk, how he discussed his team getting to the national semifinals one year against Emory. They were the number one team in the country. He talked about how there were 5 seniors on that team. He thought they deserved to win a national championship. And it came down to Eric's match, and he ended up losing in a third set tiebreaker. And he came to, I think, a rational explanation for what happened. And he realized that the team had set a goal to win the national championship, but he personally didn't do what he needed to do every day to really make that goal happen. And therefore, at the end of the season, he wasn't ready in some way to be the guy in that moment to win that match. And so he understood that. He understood, number one, regret sucks. And so he moved forward with that, right? He understood he didn't do the work. It was on him. So even though kind of like an extreme ownership perspective, he owned it, and then he changed things. So he made changes to how he worked out the following season, the conditioning that he did, etc., so that when a similar situation came up in the future, he was completely relaxed and knew that he was prepared. And in some ways, that experience was probably rather formative for him. We've often talked about the idea of necessary experiences. It's possible that Eric needed that experience as a wake-up call. But he answered the call, and he was able to attribute what happened to something that he could control, and then he moved forward to make sure that it was something that was better in the future. So that's, I think, an example of a proper way, of looking at something difficult that happened to you so that you can move forward. Do you have any thoughts, Josh, on some maybe more maladaptive or dysfunctional ways of explaining performance that you've heard, and maybe what the impacts you think are of explaining things that way to yourself?
Yeah, I would say a few of the main examples that I've experienced, that I can think of, are when players lose and they attribute it to the weather, right? And I think we see this, a lot, where somebody loses and they didn't play well, and they say, oh well, the wind, right? The wind was gusting, and and I just couldn't respond to that, right? So I think that's one key example. I think another one is when people are attributing their performances and losses often to something about the opponent, right? Maybe it's the opponent's behavior, right? Like the opponent was making bad line calls, or maybe it's the opponent's playing style. So I would say those are a couple of the more maladaptive ways of of attributing losses that I often see. I think maybe a third one is that I lost because I wasn't playing well, because I just didn't have my level that day. So if we think about each of those examples, right, where the issue here is that people are attributing it to things that in this framing that they have absolutely no control over, right? I can't control the weather, right? The weather is what it was. I can't control my opponent's line calls or my opponent's playing style, right? They're playing in a way that I don't like, or I don't tend to play as well against this type of player. And my level, I can't control that I didn't have my best level that day. So, again, if we think of those three examples, it's easy to just believe, okay, I lost because of this thing, right? I lost because of the weather. I lost because my opponent was pushing, and I don't like playing pushers. I don't play well against pushers. I lost because I didn't have my level. The issue with that is that if all of the focus is on those reasons that somebody's telling themselves, then none of the focus is on the player's response or potential response. Okay, the wind was gusting, the conditions weren't ideal. How did you respond to that? How did, your opponent was also dealing with those same conditions on the other side of the court, but every changeover you guys switch sides. So you switch sides. So they had to deal with it too. How did you deal with it? Right? You're attributing the result just to the weather, not about your response to the weather. So how did you respond to it? Okay, example B, which is about somebody's playing style, right? Or somebody's line call, your opponent's playing styles or your opponent's line calls. Again, you're talking about you're attributing it to the situation. You're not attributing it to your response to the situation. So how was your response when you felt that your opponent made an incorrect line call? How was your response when they were playing in a style that you struggle against? And again, same goes with that third example of your level, right? Okay, you're focusing on the situation of your level maybe being lower. What you're not focusing on is how did you respond to that situation, right? Did you try to make adjustments? Did you try to still have a good attitude about things? Did you still continue to fight? Did you try to problem solve and find a way? Right. And I think the issue here with some of these maladaptive attributions is that it really lets the athlete off the hook. It lets the athlete off the hook in terms of coming up with a more adaptive, more productive response, right? It allows that player to blame the result on some sort of factor out of their control rather than taking responsibility for something, rather than taking responsibility for the situation and recognizing, okay, there was something out of my control here, but I responded ultimately in a more adaptive or less adaptive way, in a more productive and more helpful or less helpful, less productive way ultimately. So I think the issue with these ways of framing is that, yeah, it completely takes the player, it completely lets the player off the hook and allows them to feel that their result was based on something that there was nothing that they could do about it.
And it ends up protecting their self-esteem, right?
Absolutely.
Protecting their ego, which I want to get back to, really relate it back to performance-based identity versus purpose-based identity. But I think another common attribution we should discuss is when players perceive that there are patterns that always happen. So, and you've probably heard this, somebody has a 5-2 lead. Oh, I always blow 5-2 leads.
Right.
Or, even on the reverse, they might be looking at it like, oh, I'm great at coming back. I always come back from 2-5 down. But I think, kind of on the reverse side, when we start to think that failure or not being successful in a certain situation is an unbreakable pattern, then again, we're outsourcing the responsibility to something uncontrollable, something outside of us. And sometimes we use the idea of stable or unstable, or you mentioned, permanent or impermanent. I think I've also heard, whether how pervasive something is. And, patterns like blowing leads, these are not unbreakable patterns. But believing they are will only perpetuate that situation. Because again, how do you move on from saying that that always happens to you to actually doing something about it? So I think it's worth talking, Josh, a little bit about how do we help players come up with better ways of explaining both success and failure to themselves so that we can continue to move forward on our journey as tennis players and on our journey toward becoming the best players that we can become.
Yeah, I think there's something called attribution retraining, right? So we can essentially help athletes to retrain how they view and process and attribute their results and performances, right? Are they focusing on factors completely out of their control when they attribute the result? Are they focusing on things that they actually do have some control over, right? Or full control over, right? And I think helping players go through that process of reflecting and hopefully reflecting in a way that is allowing them to think about things in this way, right? Allowing them to recognize, okay, there were a bunch of factors completely out of my control here, right? The wind was gusting. My opponent made a few pivotal line calls that maybe didn't help as much, that worked against me. Maybe my opponent's playing style was challenging for me, right? Maybe all of these different factors were out of my control and were challenging and tough and made it harder for me to perform. But the story doesn't end there. The attribution doesn't end there. Then it's okay. And then what? And then what did I do about it? How, when I view my performance, it should be about that. It should be about my response to all these factors, right? My response to these different challenges that I face as a tennis player, right? We've talked about how we want to, help players shift their focus from, instead of tennis being, maybe just a skill-based sport, right? Where it's not a competition of whose serve is better and whose forehand is better and whose backhand and whose volley, et cetera, et cetera. It really is a fight or a battle out there, right? And it's okay, which player is better able to handle the circumstances of a match? Which player is better able to break down their opponent? Which player is better able to identify strengths and weaknesses? Which player is better able to to problem solve and ultimately figure things out while they're out there? And to me, that sort of a perspective is so much more adaptive, so much more helpful, because it helps a player realize that they always have a certain degree of control in a situation, right? We always have that ability to figure things out and adjust and and try to find the right response, right? It doesn't mean we will win every time. We won't. Doesn't mean we'll play our best every time, because we won't. It means we have that ability to adapt, adjust, try to find a way, which is always within our control. So I think if we can shift our focus to that response piece, it tends to make all the difference.
For me, I focus on maybe three or four different concepts to help players through this. I think the first one I teased a little bit is this idea of really building a purpose-based identity.
Yep.
So if the purpose of our tennis is to become the best player we can become, we can look at today's match differently than I have to win, which would be more of a performance-based identity. So when we see sort of maladaptive attributions, it's really this feeling of a pressure of, I have to win. I'm having a hard time accepting responsibility, so I'm going to outsource the reason to something out of my control or luck or whatever. So, but when we have a purpose-based identity, we can stay more focused on what was the purpose of today's match. Today's match was about learning. So from there, we can, look at everything is practice and taking extreme ownership. So if the purpose of our tennis is to become the best we can become, all right, then today's match was really simply practicing, trying to close the gap. And for whatever happened, let's own it. Let's take responsibility for it, like the Eric Buderak story, so that we can move on. And I think then the last concept that's important to work on with players is helping them understand the two different self-talk systems that are going on in the brain. The very fast system, which is automatic, often critical and judgmental, for some of us, really difficult to control. And then the slower system, which we often refer to as your coach's voice, that we want you to speak to yourself in the second person, be motivational, encouraging, yet still instructive. Very simple. And the more that players can understand those two voices, and a lot of people have said something like, talk to yourself more, listen to yourself less. That can be hard for some players because, some of the players that I've been working with over the last several months have expressed this feeling that they can't control their negative mindset. But again, that's a kind of a pervasive thing, right? They're believing that it's out of their control, that this always happens. But slowly, with each of the players, they have come to understand the value of using their coach's voice, of taking a deep breath and speaking to themselves in good ways, because a lot of this attribution stuff can occur during a match. In certain situations, you might be feeling these things and trying to explain what's going on to yourself. I think we've even referred to this in past episodes, Josh, as explanatory style, a little bit more like from Martin Seligman than attribution theory, very similar. But we're always explaining what's going on. And if you can understand how to engage with your coach's voice more, that you're always working toward becoming the best player you can become, and that we want you to own the performance and learn from it, I think you can start to then discuss your performances in more rational, objective ways. And we as sports psych professionals can be listening for that transition, really helping players celebrate the fact that, hey, you know what? Think about how you were talking about some of your matches or about your thoughts just a few months ago. And now think about where you are today. And let's celebrate the fact that you've come a long way in that journey. And be proud of yourself because you did that work. You're the one who did it, right? Yeah, maybe I have some info or Josh has some info, but you're the one who decided to act on it. So I do think that it's a good thing to understand how we explain things to ourselves, how we attribute success and failure, such that we want to keep it with the purpose of becoming the best player that we can become. And that's going to help you have more of an adaptive and functional way of looking at success and failure in your own life.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think being able to, be aware of how we're attributing things, right? Whether it's on the court or off the court, right? And understanding, is it serving me or is it not ultimately? I think, makes quite a big difference in terms of how we move on, how we respond. Excuse me. And ultimately how we learn from or alternatively don't, or alternatively fail to learn from these performances, because it makes quite a difference in terms of, whatever comes next.
So, as we wrap this up, Josh, what are some things that you would like, maybe from a summary perspective, like listeners to know about attribution theory and style, and maybe some practical things they could do to make it better?
Yeah, I would. I mean, I think we covered a lot here. I mean, I think that um, you know, a player's attribution style, we could say, is always flexible, right? It's always changing. I mean, you can even see certain top pros when when they attribute their, you see their press conference, right? Shortly after a match, or you see the trophy ceremony where players are forced to give a speech, you know, just a few minutes after a often a heartbreaking loss for them, right? And you see certain more positive, more helpful or less helpful ways of attributing results. Oftentimes, you see players, handle that situation really graciously, right? And say, oh, their opponent deserved to win, their opponent played great, their opponent found a way. And sometimes you see players, attributing those results in less helpful ways. And I think, I think we want to, yes, if we're speaking in front of a camera, right, whether it's a trophy ceremony or a press conference, we want to try to do that in a respectful, helpful way. And we can think of examples of players who maybe haven't always done that and have maybe had to apologize for that after the fact. But also just with ourselves, we want to make sure that we are, going through a process of reflection and ultimately, attributing these results in a way that is going to set us up for the future, right? If we're blaming our results on completely uncontrollable factors, then there's nothing we can actually get from it, right? Maybe we had a match where we didn't play our best and maybe we lost, things didn't go as well, but we can recognize that that happened because we failed to adjust, or I lost because I didn't have my best attitude, right? If the difference between me feeling that I lost because of my attitude and I lost because my opponent made bad line calls, there's a really key difference here. If I feel that I lost because my opponent made bad line calls, there's sort of a helplessness attached to that, right? Okay, this is really unfortunate because if my next opponent makes bad line calls, I'm going to lose again, and then it could happen in the next tournament, in the next tournament. And what am I supposed to do? They are making the calls. So if that's the way we're viewing it, it's easy to feel, helpless, and that there's nothing we can do in the situation. It's completely out of our control. Where instead, if we feel that, okay, if we're attributing it in a very different way and we have a different perspective that, you know, incorrect line calls are going to happen sometimes. Sometimes I might think that my opponent is making bad line calls, but I might not be able to see, 72 feet. What is it, 72 or 78 feet to
78.
the 78 feet to my opponent's baseline? And I might not be able to see with perfect accuracy whether my shot hit the line, bounced 2 inches in front of the line, or 2 inches behind the line. I might not have perfect eyesight or the right angle to see that, right? So instead of me attributing the loss to line calls, and I'm not saying that players don't make incorrect line calls intentionally or unintentionally at times, because they certainly do. But instead of attributing it to that, we can say, hey, there were certain calls that were questionable. There were certain calls I disagreed with, but I lost that match because of things in my control. Ultimately, my attitude wasn't as helpful as it could have been. I didn't ultimately control my emotions when I needed to. I didn't end up resetting, and because of that, I threw a few points away in some key moments. And if we can view it like that, then we can realize that, hey, I can do better next time. I can learn from this. I can grow from this experience. I will have other moments where an opponent makes calls I disagree with. But guess what? I can respond better next time, and that can make a difference in my performance. So again, I think, how we attribute things, how we go about things in that reflection process can really make all the difference in terms of how we move on.
In that reflection process, I would actually recommend writing it out. So write out sort of an unfiltered explanation of what happened. And it could be ridiculous. But then look at it. And look at it through the lens of, okay, is this a helpful explanation? Does this help me? It's just saying that. I'd like to use almost like the 3 tests that we use to determine rational versus irrational self-talk. Is it true? Is it logical? Is it helpful? So we can look at our attributions in a very similar way. But writing it out helps, and then look at it through those lenses. And then, really critically ask yourself, okay, is this really a helpful way to explain what happened today? Probably not. All right, so what can I do about it? Because you could say, yeah, the bad calls, I lost because of the bad calls. That's not actually true. You lost because of how you responded to the bad calls. So going forward, can we respond better? Yes, probably can. And then you can figure out a plan for that on working on it. So I do think writing it out, seeing it unfiltered, and then re-looking at it, again, maybe even through some of the comments that we've made today as a lens or a framework to look at it, can really help you then move on and design a better way of explaining wins, losses, success, failure, in your own career. And this obviously applies to any performance context. This is not a tennis or even a sports-specific way of explaining things to yourself. Well, that's our show for today. Thank you all for listening. For more on today's episode, please check out the show notes. If you have any feedback or questions for me and Josh, please email us at tennisiqpodcast@gmail.com. Also, if you're enjoying the content that we discuss on the show, please rate and review the podcast so other tennis enthusiasts can find it more easily. Additionally, to be notified of new episodes, please subscribe to the show on your podcast platform of choice, including YouTube. And you can also check us out on Instagram. Thanks again, and we'll talk to you soon in our next episode.